When you imagine a battle during the Third Succession War, there are several key differences that distinguish it from those of the First and Second. Small unit actions are the norm, and the objective is rarely anything more than a raid on some exposed industrial complex. Large campaigns featuring dozens of conquering regiments are a thing of the past. Or at least, that is the perception that most people have. 99% of engagements fought in the last 150 years certainly fit that description, but every few decades, a truly colossal showdown takes place. Indeed, the largest battles the successor states were ever involved in all took place during the Third Succession War. A head of state might spend their entire life marshalling their strength for an all-or-nothing assault against a linchpin system. So it would be with the Draconis Combine's invasion of Skye. The Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces had been in retreat for near 30 years come 2895. Nothing they did worked to stem the tide, as world after world fell to the dragon. Zabebel-Ganubi had fallen 4 years earlier, and the destruction of the 3rd Sky Rangers in March gave Kurita control of the planet Freedom, from which they could launch their final assault against the capital of the Federation of Skye. The struggle for this world began in March, and it would become the largest battle of the war so far, an accolade it would hold for more than a century. In defense were the 8th Donegal Guards and the 17th Sky Rangers at the head of 12 conventional regiments, with Narhol's Raiders in support. To conquer the planet, the mustered soldiery dispatched 5 battlemech regiments and 19 conventional ones. So many times over the past 3 decades, the LCAF had folded under pressure, and the invading forces perhaps naively expected the same again. On this occasion, the garrison showed their true mettle, fighting with a fanaticism that caught the DCMS completely off guard. A pivotal moment in the campaign came in the opening weeks, when Kurita's attempt to seize the capital of New Glasgow was turned back when a flanking force was ambushed passing through Bannockburn bogs. Their failure to capture their objective would have terrible consequences. Rather than the quick victory the Draconis Combine hoped for, the campaign would drag on for 13 months. We mentioned before the differences between battles during the Succession Wars, but perhaps just as significant as the reduction in army size was the absence of weapons of mass destruction. The emergence of civilized warfare and the unofficial adoption of the ancient Ares Conventions was one of the unique features of the Third Conflict. But the Skye troops would soon return to a level of barbarity not seen for several generations. It was perhaps the passing of Archon Elizabeth Steiner on July 31st that led them to shed the last of their inhibitions, as they were no longer bound to her high moral standard. The first signs that the Lyran commanders were starting to lose control of their troops was when they began executing Kuritan POWs. Worse was to come in the days that followed. In their push towards the city of Inverness, the DCMS broke through the defensive line and was now traversing across a wide floodplain. With no other options remaining, the garrison commander asked Commodore Lisa Miles of the 348th Reserve Detachment to make the ultimate sacrifice. She loaded each of her 2 remaining sea skimmers with a 1 kiloton tactical nuke, and together they sped upriver towards the dam. One was destroyed en route, but the second collided with the base of the complex at almost 200 kilometers an hour, detonating the warhead on impact. The destruction of the dam unleashed a surge of water that annihilated the advancing column. It was the first use of a WMD in decades, and it marks the last deployment of a weapon of mass destruction to the present-day 3025. The new Archon, Erich Steiner, seemingly had no qualms about his troops making use of their nuclear arsenal, as no recriminations were ever made. To the contrary, Lisa Miles and her crew were posthumously awarded the honour of Skye. The planet would ultimately prove too much for the Draconis Combine, and the Lyrans were able to regain control over Zabebel-Ganubi in the immediate aftermath, but their invasion of the Federation continued elsewhere. In the final years of the 29th century, they took a further 6 systems from House Lestrade before they began looking for softer targets elsewhere. During their futile defense of Sakhalin, the stealthy Tigers uncovered evidence that the DCMS would soon pivot to attack the Tamar Pact, something which they relayed back to their benefactors at home. Steiner's desperation to hold the line had consequences that reached far beyond the Commonwealth's border worlds. The colony of Beta Regulus II, a planet with a population of around 6 million, was facing imminent disaster. A rogue asteroid was on a collision trajectory and was set to cause a mass extinction event. The Commonwealth sent every available dropship to airlift the populace to safety, but the depredations of the succession wars have resulted in the destruction of countless spacecraft. The relief effort had no hope of rescuing everyone. 4 million people would perish within minutes of impact. In the 80 years that followed the collapse of the Star League, around 400 systems were wiped off the navigation charts. A handful had fallen victim to natural disasters like Beta Regulus. Some were rendered inhospitable by the use of WMDs, but most suffered a slow decline brought on by famine and disease after the collapse in interstellar trade. The Third Succession War lasted twice as long as the first two combined, but it saw only a single nuclear detonation. Yet in many respects, the damage had already been done. A further 800 systems would become depopulated over the course of the war, with the lead culprit again being the critical shortage of jump ships that many communities relied on for basic supplies. The Federated Sun's Operation Pendragon concluded with the successful liberation of Robinson, but this did not bring the conflict along their Corwood border to an end. Hostile raids were a constant threat, as they were along every border within the Inner Sphere. Control of the successor state had passed to Joseph Davion II. Like his half-brother Karl before him, the first prince preferred the seat of his battle mech to the throne of New Avalon, and so looked for every opportunity to lead campaigns from the front. Unfortunately, with Joseph spending so much time away from the capital, the overall health of the realm continued to decline. Each time the government wished to pass some legislation, they first had to locate Davion on whatever battlefield his unit was posted to in order to get his approval. The issue of absentee rulers was just as prevalent on a local planetary level. The practice of granting MechWarriors landholds for their accomplishments ramped up under Joseph. With successor state industries crumbling due to never-ending wars, noble family scions were frequently called upon to support the regulars using their ancestral battle mechs, the centuries-old machines their forefathers had taken with them into retirement. What was once considered a great strength in the Federated Suns was becoming its undoing. While most retired officers desired only a peaceful life, there were a few exceptions. News of one such case, the cantankerous Marshal John Chisholm, reached the First Prince in 2897. In the 5 years since being cashiered, he had transformed the Colorado militia into a well-disciplined unit, though admittedly a rather old and poorly equipped one, capable of taking on the best. To prove his point, he challenged his perennial adversary, the Davion Brigade of Guards, to a trial by combat, facing off against their 2nd Regiment. The elite house troops should have been able to breeze to victory, but were on several occasions outmaneuvered by the retired Marshal. To reward their performance, the militia was formally inducted into the AFFS as the 1st Chisholm Raiders Regimental Combat Team. This came not a moment too soon, as the infamous Sword of Light made an effort to seize Quinton in 2899, then struck at Eri 2 years later. Thankfully for the Federated Suns, their armed forces were able to repulse both actions. In January 2901, Primus Andrea Martine was visiting CAF to speak with her successor Dwight Kirsten. The two were travelling by convoy when their car was forced off the road by a crowd of refugees. The ensuing crash caused their hovercar to ignite, and only the presenter calf was able to crawl to safety before it exploded. Before he had even time to recover from his injuries, Dwight jumped to Terra to assume the mantle of Primus. His predecessor's state funeral was an extravagant affair. For the first time since their forebears had disbanded the High Council of the Star League, several of the successor lords travelled to Earth, though they maintained a safe distance from one another. It's worth remembering that over 60 years had passed since the interdiction of the Freewells League, and this latest crop of House Lords no longer perceived ComStar as a direct threat. It did not take long for rumours around the circumstances of Andrea's death to begin circulating. It certainly would not have been out of character for a First Circuit presenter to arrange for an assassination. An inquiry into the accident inconclusively showed that Martine had already died by blunt force trauma before the fires consumed her. Dwight's decision to have those forensic investigators executed for daring to make the suggestion, as well as any others who continued to whisper about him, surely did the Primus no favours. Interestingly, his own journals reveal he suspected a plot from within ComStar to discredit him. We cannot rule out the possibility that he was already doctoring his records to mislead future historians, but it could be that Kirsten was innocent on this account. Nevertheless, his next actions made it clear that he saw his former peers among the First Circuit as an obstacle to be removed. When the position of presenter Barnard opened up, he appointed his cousin Dana Kirsten, a lowly acolyte with just 10 months' experience within ComStar. The Primus's chief opponent was presenter Kari Marie Marshall, who vociferously opposed Dana's meteoric advancement. It looked as if the Kirstens were trying to establish their own dynasty to mirror the Great Houses. The increasingly erratic Primus ordered Rom to search for any incriminating evidence that he could use against Marshall's faction. Soon after, presenter Kola was named a heretic and a traitor. Supposedly, he suffered a fatal heart attack when he was seized. The suggestion that Kola had died before his torture could take place was small comfort to those who saw their own turn under the guillotine approaching. His death served to unite the two opposition blocs within the First Circuit. Presenter Procyon Grigori Hartford proposed a secret meeting within the abandoned court of the Star League, where they could discuss their options. The First Circuit had no legal authority to remove their Primus, and also lacked any say on ROM activity. If Dwight moved to have them arrested, there was little they could do. And so they chose to leave Terra entirely and wait to see how the situation developed. On April 30th, Kirsten dispatched a message from Hilton Head to the Prime Circuit stations. In it, he named the absent presenters heretics who had conspired against him. As he saw it, they had violated the sacred word of Blake, and their punishment for this was to be burned at the stake. This shocking communique, later known as the Witch Hunt Transmission, revealed just how unstable the Primus had become. The First Circuit was not without options, however. Each presenter commanded an HPG staff that was personally loyal to them. Working together, they could effectively silence any problematic missives coming from Earth, which is exactly what they did. In effect, ROM itself was now under interdiction. When Dwight realized that none of his agents had reported in, he put 2 and 2 together. 5 jump ships were dispatched to bring the renegades to justice, while he moved his headquarters into the empty halls of Unity City. Perhaps it was the ghosts of the Cameron family themselves that pushed him over the edge. He launched a vicious and aimless purge within all branches of ComStar. Conrad Toyama's ashes were exhumed so that the Primus could discuss strategies with him. Any who questioned his decisions were executed. These actions caused a split within the historically fanatical ROM. Enough defectors went over to the First Circuit that it allowed them to remain beyond the grasp of Kirsten the Mad. In the autumn of 2901, the Primus prepared to launch Operation Winged Crusader in an effort to break the stalemate. So far, Rom had only managed to track down Presenta Quintos on Elbar, where he and 3 of his staff were shot dead. Dwight needed a stronger force to assault the Prime Circuit stations directly, and so had hired 3 regiments to do the job. This action would surely reveal the civil war raging within the upper echelons of ComStar to the successor states, perhaps prompting them to seize control of their own HPGs. More Presenters and ROM agents turned their back on Kirsten as word of Winged Crusader spread. With overwhelming support now behind the First Circuit, Gregory Hartford saw that the time had come to bring the whole sordid affair to an end. He dispatched word to Saber, a covert agent back on Terra, ordering the assassination of Dwight Kirsten. Saber proceeded to infiltrate Unity City on January 3, 2902, disabling the security measures within the Royal Palace and eliminating the guard outside the throne room. Then, in an eerie parallel to the Amaris coup, Kirsten the Mad was shot with a laser pistol at point-blank range where he sat upon the throne of the Star League. The First Circuit wasted no time in orchestrating an elaborate cover-up. They were so thorough in removing all evidence of the dispute that some doubt whether these events even took place. Publicly, the Court of the Star League was resealed after it was announced that an archaeological dig had failed to recover any useful technology. Dwight Kirsten had merely resigned from office. Gregory Hartford was named Primus and set about instituting a series of reforms. The First Circuit was given the power to remove any future Primus with a unanimous vote of no confidence, and it was also made mandatory for at least 3 Presenters to be made aware of any ROM activity. The hope was that these changes would prevent history from repeating itself. At least for the remainder of Hartford's 8 years in charge, there was no further strife within ComStar. By the dawn of the 30th century, Elizabeth Marik had largely repaired the relationship between the provinces and the ruling family. The Captain General was a strong proponent of open government. She did her best to ensure that the MPs were kept informed of her plans. Furthermore, Parliament could now appoint oversight committees to review the actions of the FWLM and SAFE. These changes helped quell any talk of repealing Resolution 288, the crucial piece of legislation that kept the Mariks in power for as long as the succession wars continued. This easing of tension allowed the Captain General to assemble a new task force in 2901, codenamed Red Rover, composed of elements of the Defenders of Andurian and Orloff Grenadiers, coincidentally the same units that their respective nobles had objected to being sent to Skye back during Philippa's reign. This time they were employed in a raiding campaign against the Capellan Confederation. Over the next decade, Red Rover was able to seize vital parts and materiel for the war effort, culminating in the capture of the jumpship Silver Frost. However, the elastic defense doctrine introduced by Otto Liao meant that they could not remain on the ground for long before overwhelming reinforcements arrived, and thus no planets changed hands. Elastic defense may have left Capellan worlds susceptible to quick raids, but they were no longer hemorrhaging territory to the Federated Suns and Freewells League. The success of the Chancellor's new strategy was best illustrated by the invasion of Sirius in 2901, timed to coincide with the Red Rover mission further inward. 3 FWLM regiments liberated the capital of the Syrian Concordance, but CCAF reinforcements arrived sooner than anyone would have thought possible. Warrior House Amara led the charge, driving the foreign invaders back. Otto Liao followed this up by dispatching some of his mercenaries to raid Talitha. His primary objective in the region was the capture of Van Diemen IV. In 2903, the Capellan task force arrived in system, but they were caught completely by surprise when they stumbled into another band of raiders from the Federated Sons at the jump point. In the dogfight that ensued, both sides sustained damage to their jump ships, stranding them in system until new transportation could be dispatched. Seeing this embarrassment unfold along their border with the more hostile Freewells League, the Chancellor made the bold decision to dispatch an emissary to New Avalon. Like his illustrious ancestor Ilsa Liao, he wished to sign a truce with Davion. Conflict between the two successor states had already been in decline, so hope was high that a bargain could be reached. Unfortunately, the first prince was nowhere to be found. When the Davion government did finally track him down, Joseph rejected the offer out of hand, just as his own predecessor Paul had done a century earlier. No amount of arguing by government officials could persuade him otherwise. Instead, he ordered an expedition to Ward in the autumn of 2904 to deprive them of some much-needed battle mechs. The successor lord would change his tune in 2905. Another raid, this one against Indicas, resulted in retaliatory hits on Akala and Novaya Zemlya. Now his senior officers threw their own support behind a ceasefire as they wished to focus on the Kuritan menace. Davion was left with no option but to meet with the Capellans at the table. The ever-worsening shortage of available transports forced the Great Houses to acknowledge the realities of the Third Succession War directly. What little aerospace industry had survived the last two conflicts was not producing nearly enough new vessels to offset combat losses and inevitable breakdowns. In a repeat of the Bell Accord from centuries prior, Davion and Liao became the first to formally restrict attacks against enemy jump ships, an agreement which House Marik soon signalled their unofficial support of. These talks provided the germ of a greater diplomatic achievement. On April 1st, 2905, the Capellan Confederation and Federated Sons signed the Armistice of Van Diemen, bringing the struggle to a halt along their shared border. In a sense, it was right on cue, as 40 years had passed since the resumption of hostilities, roughly the same duration as the First and Second Succession War. Now free to resume their campaign, Otto Liao successfully conquered Van Diemen later that year. With the Davion threat eliminated and Marik aggression deterred by the success of the Seacaf's elastic defense, the Chancellor had succeeded in sparing his realm from what looked like certain destruction. Support from Andurian and Orloff for the Red Rover mission had not come unconditionally. House Humphreys and Orloff had loaned more than half of their troops to the FWLM, as had the Border Protectorate. There was a movement in Parliament, led by Grace Sun Li, to introduce some protections for the border regions to prevent them from being left defenceless in the event that their provincial forces were conscripted for some far-off operation. The Minister of Intelligence proposed what would later become known as the Home Defence Act as a means to mitigate that danger. If imminently threatened by a hostile neighbour, a province could now withhold up to 75% of their forces, denying the Captain General those troops. Elizabeth Marik herself was a proponent of the bill, seeing it as yet another way to strengthen her hold over the Freewells League, which it surely did when in 2906 it passed without much fanfare. With her realm united behind her, the Captain General appointed her nephew Samuel to become her deputy for military affairs, and tasked him with organising the next major operation against the Lyran Commonwealth. As the old adage goes, there are only two great tragedies in life: not getting what you want and getting it. Taragi Kurita had achieved his life's ambition of sitting on the chrysanthemum throne, and it brought him no happiness. For him, the hunt had always been sweeter than the kill. He had dreamt of power, but the reality of his position as coordinator was one of drudgery and boredom. There was not much for the Draconis Combine to celebrate in the early 30th century either. The Skye invasion had been halted, and House Davion continued to chip away at their rimwood border. Several times, Taragi considered retiring from office, but he had doubts concerning his son and heir's political naivety. Ironically, it was his father's own misgivings about his martial prowess that had set him on his traitorous path. Perhaps it was the ruling Kuritan's duplicitous nature that caused him to see enemies wherever he looked. His Aunt Rowena had passed on June 4, 2905, but his surviving cousins all remained credible threats. The Draconis Combine had spent the past 6 years attempting to quarantine a virulent outbreak of albiro consumption come 2907. Taragi's determination to combat the plague head-on would be his defining legacy. He died of heart failure later that year. Shinjiro Kurita proved a more capable statesman than his father imagined. Recognizing his own shortcomings, he appointed several senior diplomats and retired officers to advisory positions and set about regaining the initiative. His efforts began with the long-anticipated invasion of the Tamar Pact. Hyperion, Shaula, and Wheel were all captured within a year of Shinjiro's ascension. The Draconis Combine was prevented from pressing their advantage by an increase in pirate activity along their Periphery border. In 2911, the Coordinator introduced a new scheme that he hoped would curb the nuisance. DCMS veterans and other volunteer bounty hunters were shipped out to the fringes of Kuritan space and tasked with exterminating the bandits. The exploits of the Grey Dragons made them minor celebrities within that region of the Inner Sphere. Archon Erich Steiner's sole aim upon taking office was to fortify his nation's defensive line at any cost. Across all branches of the Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces, barely a third of the regiments were at even 70% of their notional strength. Knowing full well that it would ruin his reputation among the common people, he made an unpopular amendment to the Military Disaster Act back in 2908 that would reduce the age of conscription down to just 16 years old, as well as closing several loopholes used to escape the draft. Those poor teenagers were also obliged to serve for 5 years before being allowed to return home. If there was any silver lining, it was that they would not face the same kind of horrors as those prior generations that fought during the First and Second Succession War. In fact, in several instances, the preponderance of heavy and assault battle mechs in the Steiner arsenal was enough for their enemy to quit the field at the mere sight of them, rather than slug it out in a costly battle in a world where materials were becoming increasingly scarce. The capture of Kobe and Severin in 2912 left no doubt as to which planet the Draconis Combine was preparing to strike at next. Tamar was in imminent danger, and Erich Steiner desperately needed some way to relieve the pressure. Operation Freedom had been in the planning stages for some time, but the schedule was accelerated in the wake of recent events. The Archon also needed to change the optics around the mass conscription of the Commonwealth's youth. Rather than sending them to the front in a futile attempt to hold the line, the LCAF would instead go on the offensive, targeting former Lyran colonies under the guise of restoring Steiner rule to those oppressed worlds. 4 systems were targeted for the first wave in 2913, with the Archon himself taking to the field during the battle for the titular freedom. There, the elite battlemech regiments of each faction, the Royal Guards and Sword of Light, would face off, with the Lyrans coming out on top in this instance. It was a victory that they would not be able to celebrate, however. As the Successor Lord was moving through the remnants of the Kuritan position, his mech trod on a vibrabomb. As it toppled to the ground, the canopy came down right on top of another mine, killing Erich Steiner instantly. Next in line to the throne was his son Simon, but the Estates General were unusually slow in arranging for his coronation. While they were prevaricating, the Freewells League was quick to take advantage when they attacked Lorik later that year. Samuel Marik dispatched 3 battlemech regiments of the Marik militia to seek out and destroy the large aerospace garrison on planet. They achieved that objective with aplomb, but were later forced to withdraw by the arrival of the Donegal Guards, which prevented them from claiming the planet outright. The reason for the Lyran government's reluctance to name Simon Archon was because of his notorious mood swings. A recessive gene within the Steiner family left them particularly susceptible to Dabrowski's Depression A syndrome, which can occasionally result in manic episodes. The fear was that his erratic behaviour would be a serious liability in a head of state. There were still some alive who remembered Archon Claudius Steiner, and though it's debated what it was that caused him to go off the deep end, people were eager to avoid a repeat. Some were openly calling for his younger sister to take the throne instead, though she shot down any talk that suggested her brother was incapable of ruling. All of this must surely have come to Simon's attention at some point over the next 6 months. How he felt about it would soon become clear. Eventually, the nobility could drag their feet no longer, and worriedly prepared to crown Simon as the 25th Archon of the Lyran Commonwealth. The court held its breath when Simon stepped forward to give a prepared speech. To the shock of everyone present, he announced that he would be withdrawing from the line of succession. Taking the chain of office from the pedestal, he turned and draped it around his sister Tatiana's neck as the two had discussed in private. He then walked out of the throne room for the last time. It marks a rather tragic moment in the history of the Inner Sphere, where someone was effectively forced to step down for mental health reasons without substantial evidence that it would have in any way hindered their ability to rule. Simon's line, while ineligible for the throne, has continued to this day. His great-grandson, Colonel Roman Steiner, serves as commander of the 3rd Royal Guards. Joseph Davion's love for his fellow MechWarriors was threatening to undo all the progress his sister had made in forging her model army. The battlemechs might have been benefiting from improved combined arms performance on the field, but off it, the elitist behaviour of their pilots was alienating the other branches. As those individuals became ever more pompous and arrogant, they formed MechWarrior Brotherhoods, a scourge that would plague the Federated Sons throughout the early 30th century. Largest of these was the Royal Order of MechWarriors and Brotherhood of Honor. Its membership exploded within the now quiet Capellan March, its leaders entirely self-serving. Their own planets were frequently held to ransom unless the petulant MechWarriors got their wishes. From their perspective, the population existed to serve their every whim and provide them with a life of luxury. After all, it was them who were risking their lives in battle. Naturally, others were opposed to this behaviour. A rival brotherhood emerged in the soldiery of the New Avalon Catholic Church. This created a ridiculous situation where members of the armed forces of the Federated Sons were doing battle with each other in the midst of the still raging Third Succession War. Obviously, such a state of affairs could not stand. When word of the Lyran Commonwealth's Operation Freedom made it to the Federated Sons, the First Prince took the opportunity to rest his exhausted troops within the Draconis March from January 2914. The Combine welcomed this return to only minor raiding, as it would allow them to focus on countering House Steiner's assault. Joseph, meanwhile, turned his attention to dealing with the rogue nobles infesting his realm. At the top of his hit list was the Royal Order of MechWarriors and Brotherhood of Honor. Partnering his personal guard with 2 companies of battlemechs from the soldiery of the New Avalon Catholic Church, he toured his realm and demanded the problem individuals cease their infantile behaviour. Most were cowed into submission at his mere approach, but conflict with the ROMBH broke out on Cluain and Novaya Zemlya. The largest battle took place at their headquarters on 40 Mile. More than 3 dozen mechs were wrecked in the Brotherhood's last stand, machines the Federated sons could ill afford to lose to internal fighting. A few stragglers would re-emerge on Hobbs 7 years later, but the Catholic soldiery was eventually able to end the menace for good. With both of his borders relatively peaceful, the first prince was finally forced to focus his attention on the more mundane affairs of state. The economy had been neglected for far too long, but the downwards trajectory was at last corrected. Bringing an end to the renegade MechWarriors also won Joseph tremendous popularity, even though it was he who had caused the whole fiasco to begin with. There were still occasional raids that grabbed his attention, even some from the supposedly neutral Capellan Confederation. The Chevaux Légers hit Atlas back in 2908, then continued their feud with the Syrtis Fusiliers when they struck the same unit on Royalston in 2915. Bristol was the most egregious instance of Liao troops ignoring the Armistice of Van Diemen, but to their credit, the armed forces of the Federated Sons launched no reprisals. The Draconis Combine was closing in on their final objective in 2915, the conquest of Tamar. To aid them in their effort, they brought across one of their best officers from the now quiet Davion border, Taisho Tugima Traveson. He commanded a force of 3 battle mech regiments and another dozen conventional ones. The Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces had only 4 regiments of infantry or armour on planet to hold the line, but they were bolstered by some of the finest mercenaries in the Inner Sphere. The homegrown stealthy tigers were front and centre in the planned defence, with 2 battalions of the Eridani Light Horse in support. Though they severely outnumbered their foe, time was of the essence. Despite the death of Archon Erich Steiner in the opening weeks of the campaign, Operation Freedom was picking up steam. If they continued to advance, the provincial capital would soon be out of reach. The Dragon's Claws closed around Tamar in March 2915, and the DCMS quickly took the upper hand, sustaining less than half of the projected casualties during landfall. Superior strategy from Tugima in the form of psychological warfare, coupled with particularly incompetent leadership from several Lyran commanders, led to a number of embarrassing defeats for the LCAF. The elite Stealthy Tigers proved no better, with a full combined arms battalion lost in an instant after clumsily marching into an ambush. It was the Commonwealth infantry who rallied first. They stubbornly held their ground in the face of overwhelming numbers. Something about their defiance in the face of impossible odds spurred on their armoured compatriots. As each month passed, Steiner was able to bring further reinforcements onto Tamar, gradually reversing their fortunes. Traveson couldn't make sense of how the situation had turned against him, but reluctantly had to call for a retreat in October. The Archon saw an opportunity to inflict further losses on the Kuritan task force as they began to depart back to the Draconis Combine. Immediately after the battle concluded, they ordered their own mercenaries to withdraw from Tamar. Kuritan agents reported their movements to the Taisho just 1 jump away. Believing he had a chance to redeem himself, Tugima led his attack group back to the capital as soon as they had rearmed. Unbeknownst to the DCMS, LCAF reinforcements were waiting at nearby Del and Vulcan. They moved to trap Traveson as soon as his forces made landfall again, quickly overrunning the Kuritan beachhead. Again, the disgraced commander was forced to call for a second retreat in 2916. This would not be the last time Steiner used this strategy. Despite being the capital of the entire Tamar Pact, only a small permanent garrison was assigned to protect the system. Raids were frequent, with another major assault coming within the next 6 decades, but there were always reserves stationed just 1 jump away, ready to pounce on whoever fell into the trap. From a strategic point of view, using the planet as bait allowed them to keep the Draconis Combine focused on that one objective. Operation Freedom was the main beneficiary of this. From a political perspective, House Kelswa strongly opposed to their homeworld being used in this fashion, and the bonds of unity between them and the ruling Steiner family were sorely tested. The Third Succession War had been smouldering for some 50 years by the time Samuel Marik came to power in 2917 after the passing of his Aunt Elizabeth. Born in 2869, he had never known any kind of life but the eternal conflict his nation was locked in. This was true for so many others across the Inner Sphere. Despite this sad fate, they did not face the same kind of horrors that their ancestors did a century earlier. Billions of people had been consumed in the fires of the First and Second Succession Wars, and more than 1,000 worlds had been abandoned since the fall of the Star League. This third conflict was far less destructive, but no less inconclusive. Each side had adopted an almost ritualistic style of combat, where they would meet each other on the field well cleared of any urban centres, then do battle until one side had sustained enough damage for them to withdraw, usually without fear of pursuit. Whereas before, the conquest of a planet might take months, with soldiers traipsing across whole continents in an effort to extinguish the last holdouts. Now the campaign might be decided in an afternoon, or as soon as weather permitted. Those MechWarriors gracious in defeat might get a chance to even the score the next year in a similar contest. Border worlds swapped allegiance with shocking regularity. The planetary population became indifferent to the change in rulership. They focused on their own lives, without concern for whichever of the distant successor states they were notionally a part of. Locals might journey out to the battleground ahead of time and set up camp on the overlooking hills to watch events unfold below, then travel home with news of which government they would be paying taxes to this month. There would always be those objectives or systems where a line in the sand would be drawn and the fighting would become more vicious. But 150 years of near uninterrupted conflict since the commencement of the Star League Civil War had taken its toll on the average person's ability to care about their supposed sovereign. The jury was still out on whether any side could bring an end to the war, but for the time being, it looked set to continue. And that brings to an end the third chapter in the Third Succession War series. It's great to get back to this after our little detour into early Terran Alliance history this last month. It's good to have a chunky episode to really dig our teeth into as well. As you know, I've rewritten the Third Succession War scripts a number of times now, and I'm having to do it again now that I've got all of those dates gathered from the TROs. Thank you very much to those 4 individuals who volunteered their time to help me complete that task, that being Colonel Overkill, Ian Fletcher, Super Sylph, and Warsteiner. I would never have had the patience to go through all of those TROs myself again. I've read them in the past, of course, but it's essentially giving myself another novel of material to read. And if you're a long-time viewer, you probably know that my interest is more in the political side of things rather than the machinery, the battle mechs, the vehicles. There's a few things to discuss on this episode. First of all, there are a lot of conflicting dates from a lot of different sourcebooks. I'm fairly confident in the order in which I presented these things in this video. If you have any questions about anything in any of these videos, I'm always happy to try and point you towards the sources where I get my information from. Unfortunately, because those books are so unreliable, Sarna itself suffers from this same problem because they're just copying those same dates at face value. And it's only when you look at the grander narrative you can see what was supposed to be happening at a given point in time. And of course there's the ever-present issue of newer sources only referring to their older equivalent and copying those same errors into the future, so the contradictions continue to exist in the lore. I've read some comments by people saying, oh, they love that because it's like real history where certain facts are unknown. Well, I'm of a different opinion. It's all very well withholding information about something you want to be unknown, but we shouldn't accept what are simply mistakes continuing to propagate. Anyway, enough about the production of this one. What happened this episode? Well, we had the very last nuclear warhead explosion that I'm aware of anyway, up until 3025, there's certainly more to come later. It's only a 1 kiloton, little baby nuke, but it's still significant, and I thought I'd make it the title of this video. I was also really surprised when I was reading through the sourcebooks to learn that for a few years, the Federated Sons was completely out of the Third Succession War. Like, they'd made peace with the Capellan confederations, more or less, and they just kind of mutually agreed not to bother the Draconis Combine. And they're just doing their own thing over there in the corner. Of course, they're well aware that the conflict is still raging elsewhere in the Inner Sphere, so it makes perfect sense that they would still consider the Third Succession War to be continuing, whether they're fighting in it or not. But that's definitely a fun anomaly in the timeline. Also, the worst name for any faction in the setting probably goes to the Royal Order of MechWarriors and Brotherhood of Honor. That's just a ridiculous mouthful to have to say multiple times. The most interesting event from this chapter for me, though, was the ComStar Civil War, or however you want to refer to it, the interdiction of Earth. There's so much more history to that faction than I realized. It's actually my first time reading the ComStar sourcebook when I was writing these scripts, and so I was very surprised that there is as much ComStar as there is any other faction, perhaps more than any single successor state. They're going to feature just as prominently in the next chapter as well. Let's briefly talk about that. We've got a confrontation between ComStar and the Draconis Combine. We've got Operation Roland's Horn, one of the biggest campaigns of the Third Succession War. The creation of perhaps the most famous military branch within the Inner Sphere. Dozens of other battles, of course, but also the emergence of a particularly poor crop of successor lords. In the mid-30th century, every great house goes into a period of decline as each one of their rulers is struggling to hold things together, not doing a good job. So you'll learn more about their trials and tribulations next time. Anyway, this was already a very long episode, and this was an even longer outro, so let's wrap things up. Thank you, as ever, for watching. I'm really pleased you all enjoyed the Terran Alliance series, but I'm sure you're happy to see us back with the Third Succession War now. If you did enjoy this chapter, leave it a like, leave me a comment. I read every single one, and I do try to respond to as many people as I can. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. Sharing the video around with anyone else you know who enjoys BattleTech history is also very beneficial. YouTube loves to see it, and it promotes the video more on the platform, which is definitely a boon for the channel. If you do want to support me, you can follow the link in the video description to my Patreon. I upload videos there early before their premieres on YouTube, though I will tell you now, I've got a holiday coming up at the end of September, and it's quite unlikely I'm going to get another video out before I go away, so I leave it up to yourself there. Thank you very much for watching, thank you very much for your kind words and support. The compilation video of the Terran Alliance will be out at some point in the next week or two, but we will be back with another chapter of the Third Succession War soon after, and I hope to see you all then.